to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you an interesting game that's an excellent example on how to play when both sides are castling on opposite sides of the chessboard. Let's see the game between Grandmasters Petrosian and Wojtkiewicz. Here we go. The game started with d4 and Black chose the so-called King's Indian defense. These are all very normal and standard starting moves in this opening, and here White has many choices. For example, playing knight f3, playing f3, which would be called the Zamish variation, playing f4 even, the 4 pawns attack, and many more often played choices. In this game, White chose a variation named after the famous Russian grandmaster Yuri Averbakh. That line starts when you see those two bishops' moves played together one after another in this very same sequence. Here Black can try various moves, but most often Black responds here by playing c5. This immediately targets White's center d4 pawn, and now White needs to make a choice whether to defend that pawn, advance it, or trade on c5. In most games here, White would advance the pawn, which would give White a little bit of space advantage in the center and the queen side. However, Black of course has some interesting counterplay also. In this game, Black continued with h6, and here the bishop retreated to f4. The idea of moving the bishop to f4 compared to, for example, e3, which of course is also played, that if Black would try to play e6, transposing onto a Benoni type of positions, opening the e-file, then after pawn takes, White would target the d6 pawn a second time. In this game, Black played rook e8, preparing that very idea, so after e6 and pawn takes passively, the rook could even take back, protecting the pawn on d6. Or, in some other cases, after e6 and there is a trade of the Black e-pawn, the Black rook, of course, is ideally positioned, targeting White's e4 pawn. White played queen d2, doubling up on the diagonal and to attack the pawn on h6. Black simply played king h7 to protect the pawn. And here White played a very risky move that actually we see quite rarely, especially in queen-pawn openings. It's interesting that for some reason, in openings that start with e4, that is the king-pawn move, you would see choices of castling to the queen side a whole lot more often than you do in queen-pawn openings. So White played this risky move by castling to the queen side, and Black immediately got to action to open files against the king. Black played b5, so look at Black's play, how Black is developing an extremely dangerous attack. Now this move, of course, is a pawn sacrifice. However, one of the most important messages I'd like to get across is that when you trying to develop an attack against a king that has castled to the opposite side than you did, it's very common and normal to give a pawn up in order for your rook or rooks to have an attack on that file. In this case, if White would capture the pawn with the knight, then the pawn on e4 on turn would also get lost. If the pawn would capture, black would play a very typical for such situations move, a6, offering another trade of pawns, which white cannot avoid other than he would push the pawn forward and return the extra pawn. And for example, after a situation that pawn would take, black would recapture with either the bishop or the knight, and then bring the knight to b4 on the following moves, and attack the pawn on a2, and also play c4 and perhaps knight d3 check. Of course, the ideas would be to bring also the black queen to a5, the other rook to b8. Black would have a tremendous attack, well worth the sacrificed pawn. Let's go back to the game position. Here we go, b5, and white chose to play simply f3, protecting the pawn on e4. You may wonder, why would white need to do that? The reason is that if white would have made, for example, a developing move, knight f3, black could advance the b pawn, chase the knight away from the pawn on e4, and then just capture that with his knight from f6. Let's continue with the actual game, where white played f3, protecting the pawn. And here, black followed up by playing queen a5. As we know, the queen is the most important attacking piece in chess. And black is bringing that very piece, in fact, immediately threatening to again advance the pawn, b4, to chase the white knight away from the protection this time of the a2 pawn. Remember, a move ago, it was all about the e4 pawn. Now things have turned, and it's about the a2 pawn. If right now, white would capture the pawn with the knight on b5, now that the pawn on e4 is already protected, the problem is the pawn on a2. And if white would now try to play knight c7, which is actually a pretty good looking idea, trapping the rook in the corner, forking both black rooks, looks pretty good. However, if you look closer, black has a very nice combination here. I would suggest to pause for a little bit and try to take a few minutes on your own and try to figure out what should black do right now. And the answer is, black should be playing knight d5, a beautiful combination, sacrificing the knight, and for example, after knight takes, queen check. Of course, the main point of the sacrifice was to open up the power of the bishop from g7. And now, after king c2, the bishop and the queen is cooperating. Black can capture the pawn, and more importantly, chase the white king around all the way to d3. Queen b3, almost checkmate, but the knight can still block. And now, bishop a6, targeting the pawn on c4. Well, the bottom line is, white, even if they won't get checkmate right away, but they'll certainly lose the knight on c3. Let's go back again to the game line. After queen a5, actually, white took the pawn on b5 with the pawn. The best choice was to play king b1, protecting the pawn on a2. Perhaps white was scared to do that in view of black playing b4, attacking the knight. And if you look around, the poor knight has nowhere to go but to b5, where seemingly the knight will be trapped right away after a6. However, in reality it will not be, because luckily for white, the knight can still escape with knight a3 because of the pin on the pawn on b4. On the other hand, perhaps what white really didn't like was black queen first retreating to b6, and then, as there is no longer a pin over the b4 pawn, then to play a6. So it's certainly not a pleasant situation. Let's go back again and see how the game continued after white played, indeed, pawn takes pawn. Black played with a6. This is a banker gambit style of sacrifice, and there is such an opening that would result just after 3 moves into the opening. After I finish showing this game, I'll show you quickly what are the starting moves of that opening. While this is not a banker gambit, this idea has been borrowed from that common and popular opening. As I mentioned earlier, if pawn takes, black happily recaptures and then activates his rook from e8 going to b8. After a trade, the knight will come to b4 and black will have an excellent attack. White decided not to try to hang on to his extra pawn, but instead advanced the b5 pawn to b6. The black queen, of course, could capture the pawn right now. However, black can do better, namely by playing knight b to d7. Black would like to capture that pawn with his knight, because that knight wants to go, for example, to a4, and the black queen is already ideally located on a5, so it does not want to retreat. White played b7, understanding that that pawn is lost one way or another, and trying to put or to force the black bishop onto the b file to be in the way of the black rooks. What can poor white do other than defend? Well, they can try to go for a counterattack. However, white's attack is a bit too slow in this case. White played g4. Typically, those are the right type of attacking moves. However, remember one thing. When the two kings are castled on opposite sides and files are opening, pawns are being pushed up to attack, it becomes a matter of a race. Whoever succeeds to open files and create immediate threats first is the one likely to win. Came rook e to b8, h4, and now bishop c8, a very logical move to open up the b file so the rook can fully target the b file and the b2 pawn. And white played queen c2, and pretty amazingly, black is ready for action and to convert his nice position, his positional advantage, on attacking to material advantage. White here had to face a very dangerous attack, starting with a beautiful sacrifice of rook b2. If right now white captures back with the queen, black's plan was to play knight e4 with a second sacrifice to open up the diagonal of the bishop, and the white king and queen are in unfortunate situations. If the queen goes to c2, that would allow a check, and then after rook b8, checkmate would arrive very shortly. On the other hand, if the white queen right now would move to b3, then again the rook would move first to b8, and when the white queen leaves the protection of the a3 square, then the queen would go there, and white would either get checkmated or lose his queen within a couple of moves. Instead, the game continued by the white king capturing on b2. Black needs to follow up aggressively, rook b8. Again, if the king would remain on this diagonal, then the black knight could jump to d5 or e4, open up the diagonal of the bishop, and then again, checkmate would be around the corner. The white king moved to c1, queen a3. The chase continues. King moved to d2, and now simply pinning the queen. Black made it look pretty simple, didn't he? In just about 20 moves, white is already lost. The game continued with rook b1. Now if black would simply capture the queen on c2, white would be through the worst, because white would have 2 rooks for black's queen and 1 extra pawn, and things wouldn't be that bad. However, black can do better, and in fact, Grandmaster Wojtkiewicz found the correct sacrifice. A second sacrifice, knight e4. White recaptured with the knight, and now it was time to capture the queen, followed by f5. Pawn takes, and now sadly for white, if white would move the knight back to d2, the problem is that the bishop on f4 is unprotected, and after a queen a4 check, the bishop will be lost. Also, black would be able to first capture the pawn on a2, pick that up, and then after a second check, then play the fork with queen a4. White continued, understanding that they have to lose a piece with bishop d3. And now black could just have taken the pawn on a2 right away, but played another move that wasn't bad at all, c4. White played knight g5, check, pawn takes, bishop f5, king g8. If right now white would have played pawn takes pawn, black could capture the pawn, check, and then play queen g2, attacking the white rook in the corner, the rook that's protecting the knight on g1. So what that means is that after the rook moves now, white would lose the knight on g1. Let's go back just a bit. White continued with bishop d2, queen a2 check, king c1, and after knight c5, white resigned. What happens now is the black bishop is attacking the white bishop on f5, and if white would capture the black bishop, then knight d3 check would chase the king away from the rook, and black would win further material. A pretty impressive game to show why it's so risky oftentimes to castle to the queen side, especially in the queen-pawn openings. Just before we go further on to the jewel of the week, let me show you, as promised, what is the banker gambit. The banker gambit would start with d4, knight f6, c4, c5. Of course, white now could capture on c5, however, could not hang on to the pawn for very long. Pawn d5 and now b5. This would be called the banker gambit. The idea of the opening is, even though the white king hasn't yet castled at all, or definitely not to the queen side, to open the b and a files. Typically, white would win a pawn, but black would get pressure on the b and a files, on the b2 and a2 pawns. It's a very interesting gambit that was invented somewhere in the 1960s and became rather popular in the 1970s and 80s. Since then, white have found some solid ways to play against it, but it's still definitely not a refuted opening. It's a fun opening to play with black, even though probably on the highest level it's a bit risky, but up to professional level, definitely an interesting idea to play with black. And finally, let's move on to the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this pawn endgame, each side has a passed pawn. Both pawns are 3 pawns away from the promotion square. Therefore, this seems a pretty easy win for white. So here, the first challenge is to figure out what is the challenge. I'll give you some time to figure out why aren't things so easy as they seem. Let me show you what the challenge is. If white simply advances the pawn, and so does black, and then promotes the pawn to a queen, and seemingly wins the race, because if queen promotes and queen takes queen, then you better realize that this is a stalemate, and all of a sudden the game is a draw. So that's the challenge. So how should white win this game if it's not so simple? Well, obviously white needs to push the pawn, otherwise black will win the race and black will even win the game. So the trick is that white in this position needs to promote the pawn to a rook only. Now if the pawn promotes and rook takes queen, there is no more stalemate in the picture, as the black king can easily move to a2. And after king a2, to help the pawn promote the following move, then king a4, b1, queen, rook takes, king takes, and now king b3. Simply running after the black's last pawn, and sadly for black, the king is behind the white pawn, which will not help it to catch or stop from promoting. And this pawn now is going the other way, of course, not the opposite way. And next move, the white king will simply move out from the f2 pawn's way, and then the pawn will just run away and get promoted. Very nice little endgame by Grigoriev. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.